Hey guys, so we are in lesson 2 on unit 3. So now we're talking about the history of agriculture, and we kind of dipped into that with John Deere. But we'll talk about how kind of agriculture got started as we know it today. So way back in the caveman times, they hunted animals living nomadically. That means a nomad is where they followed the herds that provided their food. The start of and they gathered fruits, vegetables, and nuts and grains around them. The start of agriculture allowed people to stay more in one place, and this allowed them to build villages and build communities. So more than 10,000 years ago, slowly in a number of locations, it started changing. So that's when some of the early farmers started growing plants that lived around them, and they got tired of moving around. So they started domesticating some animals like cattle and sheep, and planting and raising crops. And this allowed them to build villages and to eventually build society. So we have agriculture to thank for the life that we have now. Um, says people moved from nomadic villages. Nomadic is small communities that moved with the animals to towns. They had to live in groups to care for the crops and plant and harvest. With addition to animals, they had access to new food sources like milk, because they had more to care for, so they could milk cattle. The food supply was more stable, and people had more time to invest in culture and things of that nature. And that's really what started society as we know it. So we use the introduction of ag to mark the change in periods from Paleolithic, which is the Stone Age, to Neolithic, which is the New Stone Age. So make sure you know those. So it talks about what did early people eat. They didn't have a lot of choices, but they ate something like stew and porridge. Whatever food they were available, they would cook together in a pot over a fire, including grains, vegetables, and meat, and kind of put it all together. So agriculture did change human society in more way than just what they ate. Families grew in size. They led to a lower reproductive rate if they were moving around all the time. Bigger families were needed to provide workers. That's when we started seeing our people have the 10 children families. Culture grew and developed. People had time. They weren't just trying to survive. They had time for other things, to use their minds, to start showing social hierarchy. People learned to keep records, to count, and eventually to write. Milk was available, which offered feeding alternatives to infants who'd lost their mothers or needed that additional nutrient. Came from cattle and also sheep and goats. First crops, domesticated, which means adapted for human use, varied from where you were. So you would domesticate what was around you. So it says in the ancient Near East, varieties of wheat and barley were domesticated. East Asia, they domesticated rice and millet. Lentils, peas, and chickpeas were domesticated early, which were a really good source of protein. So, and this also required new technology. This leads to ovens to make bread. Brewers learned to make beer. And all of these sorts of jobs started just emerging through agriculture. So baking and brewing are surprisingly closely intertwined. It says both baking bread and brewing beer rely on yeast, and that's an early form of biotechnology. So this was really advanced back in the day. And it says that they were actually probably accidentally made. The first beer probably came about resulting a forgotten bread dough, and we think of it as an alcoholic drink. Often they were really low in alcohol and high in energy, providing carbs for them to work for a long time. The wheel is really closely linked to agriculture, which they say is considered as the best invention ever because it developed so much, but it didn't develop until early in human history. So what do you think the first wheels were used for? They were not used for wagon wheels. It was actually a potter's wheel to make a pot vessel or a jar. So these were things for cooking, for using those new things in agriculture. And then later, around 3200 BC, came the chariot wheels, and the wheeled plow and wheelbarrow came much later. So agriculture not only helped us with the food that we eat, but it helped really create society that we know it. It gave people a chance to use their brains for something else besides surviving.